It's a great pleasure to be with you all today, King's College Chapel. I've got a lot to say, and I may have to go quite quickly to fit both the building and the stained glass in. I guess when most of you came to Cambridge for the first time and walked along King's College Chapel, you would have been amazed at the size of the chapel of one college, King's College. An enormous chapel. So what we've got to do in our time together is try to establish why this chapel is there and why it looks as it does. Now, here's an aerial view, and we can see the chapel here. Even today, it dominates the Cambridge townscape. Now, just imagine, this chapel was founded in 1448. You're going to have to listen to a lot of dates, by the way. 1448, register that. When this chapel was founded, almost nothing that you see on that screen existed. All these colleges here, St. John's and Trinity and Gonville and Keys, if they existed at all, they were tiny little hostels. And that's true of the townscape on this side. You can see something of old Cambridge over here. So when this chapel the building began, it was prodigious. And it dominated a tiny little town, which most visitors who came to Cambridge in the 15th century regarded as filthy. A filthy little town of timber buildings, with little hostels for students scattered here and there. And then in the middle, this enormous building was begun. Why? Well, it's all to do with this man, Henry VI. Over here, by the way, and it's very difficult, I know, for you to see this in detail, is a map of what Cambridge would have looked like around about 1400, not long before the building of King's College Chapel started. And these little squares here are mostly the hostels. Some of them are actually priories, that's for friars and monks and brothers, scattered around. And our King's College Chapel is about there. You don't see it on the map, of course, but there you are. And that's what will become King's Parade. So a tiny little town. Now, Cambridge University, by the way, was established in the early 13th century, 1208. And of course it was the twin of Oxford University. If you had asked somebody in one of the great universities of Europe, let's say Bologna, Padua, Paris, what's your opinion of Cambridge University? This is around about 1400, by the way. They would probably have said, where? Cambridge University had not managed to produce a single significant thinker in its 200 years of existence. If you'd have asked the same person, now what do you think of Oxford University? Well, that is a great university, full of thinkers whose ideas have spread across Europe, sometimes very disruptively, but a powerhouse of intellectuality. So and yet we've got a paradox, haven't we? Because this chapel we're going to study outsizes anything that you'll find in Oxford or anything anywhere else in Europe. There's nothing to compare with it. You can go to any of the ancient universities of Europe and you won't find anything like King's College Chapel. So we've got a big question. What is this? Well, what's this to? Well, coming back to this man, the simplest explanation is that he was the 15th century English Ceausescu. If you know that name, the Romanian dictator who demolished and built in a megalomaniac way. Because there's no doubt this man was unhinged. He became King of England and then King of France. He was king of both countries at the age of 3. And it's as if power went to his head and just unbalanced him. And this chapel that we're going to study, we'll get to it in a moment, and I'll go through it very quickly, of course, isn't really a university chapel at all. It's a royal chapel. That's where the name comes from. In other words, it's an enterprise of the king and his successors in Westminster. They've decided, or he's decided at first, to pour resources into this massive scheme in this out-of-the-way and, well, not quite insignificant, but not very significant town on the edge of the fens. So, there we are. So let's proceed. Now, Cambridge colleges did have chapels, although most of them simply used the local parish church as their chapel. But where they did have a purpose-built chapel, they were like this at Magdalen. In other words, little brick boxes. There's nothing remarkable, really, about them. So I'll move on from that. Henry VI, this deranged king, did go to Oxford, and he did see improved versions. So if you go to Oxford, you can see chapels like this one at All Souls College or at New College, which have more of a presence. You know, you can see that they're rather grand chapels. And this excited this young king. He thought, well, my chapel is going to be even bigger than these in Oxford. And, so this is all the origins of the chapel, because he was a king, he had his own chapels. His chapel in Paris, remember he was King of France, was the Sainte-Chapelle in Paris. I just want you to note, by the way, that it has an under-chapel and an over-chapel. It's a very, very precious building, this one, containing important relics. We won't go into that. And in Westminster, the king had this chapel, which burnt down and has been rebuilt. This is St. Stephen's Chapel. Now, in this one, by the way, was modelled on this one to an extent. And you can see something of King's College Chapel here in miniature. But you see there's an under-chapel and an over-chapel. So the king did know about chapels in Oxford and in Westminster. And he had another enterprise. He decided to link Eton College, which is opposite Windsor, a new school, to his new King's College in Cambridge, so that the scholars of Eton, the boys from Eton, could progress to Cambridge. And for that purpose, he built a great big chapel in Eton, which you can see from Windsor, just across the river. Magnificent. Now, I hope you can see, again, it seems to be on 2 levels. There you are, great big box on 2 levels. By the way, this is the English way of doing things. The English build boxes. If you look at Great St. Mary's, what is it but a sequence of boxes? The tower, the aisles, the nave, the porches, boxes, 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 boxes. That's how the English do things. And most English people, by the way, are completely blind to this. They don't really notice. But the great German art historian Pevsner, when he came to England, he noticed, and he was puzzled by it, this addiction to boxes. But anyway, we'll carry on from that. But nothing prepares us for this. After everything we've seen, the Royal Chapels, the Oxford Chapels, Eton College, poof! The scale of this is sensational, and far bigger than any college, no matter how big that college actually requires. And we're struck, aren't we, by, again, it's boxiness, it's an enormous stretch shoebox. It's regularity and repetitiveness. Everything seems to be exactly the same all the way along. And notice, by the way, those 2 levels, 1, 2. Although, actually, this is not an under-chapel. It isn't below the rest, it's on the same level, but it looks as if it is here. Now, that's the west end, that's the east end, this is the south side, that's the north side. By the way, There was another chapel built on the other side as a temporary chapel that's completely disappeared. I won't look at that at the moment. So we've got to think about this, the regularity of this. Now, it actually took 100 years to build. Building began in 1448. The king had purchased all this land, demolishing streets, houses, churches, all the way down to the river to create this vast college with its enormous chapel. This was a royal college after all. And he was very precise about what he wanted. Now, I won't go into this in great detail, but he set out a specification, which is very, very rare. What was that music, by the way?
That's music.
It's very, very rare in medieval in medieval culture.
Have
You know.
synthesizers.
It's going to be somewhere. Anyway, we'll just enjoy the music as well. But let me say that the king was so involved in this project, he neglected all his statecraft. A war was starting in France, the French rebelling against his kingship, but he didn't involve himself in it, and very rapidly he lost his French territories, and he was completely absorbed in this giant scheme, and actually set out the specifications, obviously with his advisors, you know, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, the Bishop of Winchester, the Archbishop of Canterbury, his great uncle Cardinal Beaufort. They were all the king's advisors, all huddled round, and they specified exactly what they wanted. So we know this. They said this is by the way called the antechapel. It's very confusing, isn't it? Because that middle bit is the chapel. The antechapel, 120 feet by 40 feet, ratio of 3:1. Each of the chapels 20 feet by 10 feet. He said that the height has to be 90 feet. This chapel has to be 90 feet long, and so on and so forth. He even specified the levels. The whole chapel 4 feet above the ground. If you've been in King's College Chapel, have you ever thought you climb up some steps, don't you, to go into the chapel? People do this without thinking. That's what the king wanted. He said 4 feet. That's exactly what happened. He specified the 2 steps there, the 7 steps at that end, and so on. So all perfectly worked out by the king and his advisors. So that's the plan. And he also, this is extremely rare, specified something about the style. So he says, and I will, that means I want, that the edification, the building of my same college proceed in large form. I want it to be big, clean and substantial, setting apart without superfluity, too much, of too great curious works of entail. That's too much detail and busy moulding. In other words, I don't want it to have all sorts of decorations. It's to be big and plain. So that's what he says. And that may reflect his piety. He was a very pious man. Now, this is a long story, and I'm not going to tell the long story. What you need to know, though, is that the college chapel took 100 years to build, and that covered 5 monarchs' reigns. So Henry VI, Edward IV, Richard III, Henry VII, Henry VIII. That's 3 dynasties: the Lancastrians, the Yorkists, and the Tudors. And these people were at war with one another. So this is why I've put this lurid red stripe down here to indicate the Battle of Towton and the English Civil War. It's enough for you to know that this king killed this king. And in effect, because of the Battle of Bosworth, this king killed this king. So they're at war with one another, and yet they're all sponsors and patrons of the chapel. So, and you can see something of this very divisive history in the stones of the chapel. So when you go to the chapel, I want you to look for this. So there is our chapel, and here you can see this is the bit that Henry VI built before he was deposed and killed. This is the bit like that Edward IV and Richard III built before Richard III was killed and deposed. And that bit there is the bit that Henry VII and Henry VIII built. Now, what I think is remarkable is that it's very difficult to see that at all. But you can just about see it. I'll show you. If you go to the north side of the chapel, you see this, can you see? Now, it's not easy to see on this screen, but there's a white stone there. That's the stone of Henry VI, the first building campaign. That's magnesium limestone. It comes from Yorkshire, came all the way down from Yorkshire, the very best stone. And then this is the Northamptonshire stone of Edward IV. So you can see in the exterior the breaks that are happening in the building. Now, some people think, oh, these great buildings took 100 years to build. No, they didn't. If the money was there, the medieval builders would crack on. They got things done very quickly, much quicker than we do, because of they didn't have health and safety regulations. So what stops them building is the interruption in the flow of capital, that's all. And that's the result largely of wars. So let's understand that. Now, we haven't much time, so it's a bit helter-skelter this, but having looked a little at the outside, of course there's a lot more to say about the outside. Let's have a look at the inside, and we've come in now, and when you come into the chapel, some of you I know will have been already and some won't, but all of us are now going to go into the chapel. We're all going to do this. And we go in and we rise 4 feet and we think, oh, that's Henry VI. But you're not going to do what everybody else does, which is to linger or stay here. You're going to march right down to the other end and do the chapel backwards. So that's what we're going to do. We're walking down the chapel now and we're going to the east end. So here are the choir stalls. And we're going to look at these walls. So here we are. We're right at the end of the chapel. And remember, this is the work of Henry VI. So it's the first part of the chapel to be built. And remember what Henry VI said, I want my chapel to be clean and substantial. No busy mouldings, no detailing. I want it plain. The best stone, the best workmanship, but I don't want it to be anything other than plain. And that's exactly what you see. Now it may be, it's been speculated that perhaps at times these walls might have been covered with tapestries or something, but there's no mistaking that this is a very plain building. There was a tradition, of course, this is what we now call Roman Catholicism, of austerity, of believing that this sort of plainness is godly. And that seems to be what's driving this. So I hope you can see this here too. Now I'm going to pause a little because we still haven't quite got to the heart of this question of what on earth is this enormous chapel doing in Cambridge? I've sort of left that question a little behind. But there's something we've got to keep in mind, and we can do it while we're just pausing at the East End and looking at this now. Because there was a big problem with Oxford University at this time. And that's to do with the cleverness of the Oxford scholars. Clever scholars begin to think what they're not supposed to think. And one in particular, called John Wycliffe, in the late 14th century, started lecturing and preaching in Oxford outrageous ideas. The kings and popes, they don't get their authority from God. Why should we listen to them? The hierarchy of the church, cardinals, bishops, all the rest of it, that's just Worldliness, let's get rid of them. Images, pictures, like in the windows you see here. Oh, ungodly, we don't know, they're a terrible distraction, we don't want them. Confession, confessing sins in the Catholic Church, nonsense. The Eucharist, the body and blood of Jesus Christ in a bit of bread and wine. The Bible, which was in Latin, let's have it in English. Outrageous ideas, which by the way trigger a European revolution. In Czechoslovakia or Bohemia, the Hussites pick up on these ideas and start rebelling against the Catholic Church, and eventually Luther in Germany. It doesn't come from nowhere. The origin is in Oxford of all places. So now what's going on here? The kings did not like these ideas. They did not like a university that was so disruptive. So I think what's going on here, because it's not just Henry VI who starts looking towards Cambridge, it's every dynasty starts looking towards Cambridge. Let's establish an orthodox and reliable university, one which will do what is proper and respect the authority of kings. And what you find actually is that between 1440 and 1540, when the King's College Chapel is being built, not a single royal college is founded in Oxford, not a single one. And in Cambridge, we have King's, Trinity, St. John's, Christ's, all royal colleges. All royal colleges. In other words, the whole parade along King's Parade and Trinity Street, all those great colleges, they're all Westminster colleges. They're founded from London. They make Cambridge into a great university. So that by 1511, when again, we'll see this in a moment, the latter part of this college is being built, the greatest scholar in Northern Europe, Erasmus of Rotterdam, chooses, he could go anywhere in Europe. Everybody wants him, he's the superstar. But where does he go? Does he go to Oxford? He goes to Cambridge. He goes to Queen's College and stays there for 5 years and is full of praise for the brilliant scholarship now of Cambridge. So it's in this century that things change. Now back to the chapel, when you go there, everybody passes through this door into the exhibition. They don't take any notice of it. You should. It's absolutely exquisite. It just shows you that the best masons, this is Reginald of Ely by the way, were employed for these. I know it's a detail, but it's not busy. I mean, just have a look at the mouldings here. You can't see it in the photograph. And then, of course, you've got the little chapels all along the side. 18 of them, which all had little altars and were meant really for the burials of the fellows or the dons, of whom there were 70 originally. So let's look at that. Now, having looked at the East End, let's wing our way to the West End, because we haven't a great deal of time. Let's just have a look at the West End, because remember, if you're still paying attention, I'm sure you are, the West End was built by Henry VII and Henry VIII. So this is all Tudor, and it looks completely different. This is the ante-chapel. Its purpose, by the way, was partly to provide a reception hall for the kings and queens when they came to Cambridge. The big west door would be opened, and Elizabeth I, for instance, and the retinue would come into this enormous space, you know, magnificent, absolutely magnificent. Now, what I was saying about how quickly they could do things, this whole building here was begun in 1508, and all of this, apart from the vault, all of this was completed by 1512, 4 years, the lot. That's how quickly they could go, and it's phenomenal. And you can see that there's wonderful carving all along the walls. Now, I'll just point out, because there's so much to say about all of this, one or two features. First of all, if you go back, if you look at, I know it's very difficult to see, but when you go in there, people will think you're quite mad, of course, you're not doing what everybody else is doing, but you're going to be looking at this here, for instance, where you can see some of the white stone, the magnesian limestone. That has its origins in Mont Saint-Michel. The upper chapel there, it's the same, a very similar arrangement. So Reginald of Ely, the King's Mason, had obviously been here, after all it was English territory, and had studied what these French masons were doing. So that's interesting in itself. And then when we look at the walls, the lower walls, one thing that's very striking is all this carving, crowns, greyhounds, dragons, portcullises, shields, amazing carving, all in stone. This is cast stone, by the way, from Normandy, very finely carved by Thomas Stockton, the royal carver from Westminster, and everywhere celebrating the power of the Tudor monarchy. These are all Tudor and Beaufort's, that's Henry VII's mother's, emblems. So, and this isn't sacrilegious, this is the proper display of a Christian prince's power in the chapel. So there you are. It was all originally meant to be painted and gilded, but that isn't very English at all. If you want to see anything similar, there's a shield, for instance, and look at this here. All this heavy, rich carving on walls. You have to go to Burgos in Spain. Now, what on earth could King's College Chapel have to do with Burgos in Spain? Well, it has to do with, who's going to tell me this now? Who was Catherine of Aragon? Absolutely. So Henry VIII's embassies had been to Aragon, and they'd seen Spanish work, and they'd been mightily impressed. And a version of that is what you see in King's College Chapel, because you don't see that carving anywhere else in England. So it's a very eclectic place. So we have to move on from that because, well, I had wanted to just point out that this, just a little detail here, you see that it's a very architectural point, this, but in this west end, you'll see these vertical lines. You might see it better here. Look, they rise up and up and up, uninterrupted like this. And here, this one, watch it from there, passes over glass, wall, glass again, up and up and up, wall to the vault like that. It's like a trellis. You've got the horizontals and you've got the verticals. Everywhere you look, it's the same sort of thing. That idea, by the way, comes from Gloucester. If you go to Gloucester Cathedral, you see just the same arrangement, and Gloucester was a royal mausoleum. There's the mausoleum to Edward II, but I'll pass on from that because there's more to say, but very quickly. Now let's think about the vault. When you go to King's, you look up and it's sensational. It is sensational. That is a typical French. By the way, when I say vault, I mean what you might call the ceiling or the roof, but the word we use is vault. That's the typical French way of doing it, very simple. That's the typical English way of doing it, that's Norwich, not simple at all. The English just love making patterns. Patterns, patterns, patterns. And that is what the sort of vault that King's was intended to have. But at Gloucester, there was another idea. Just this is simply an English idea, fan vaults. These are called fan vaults. There's a lot I could say, but we have to press on because King's has a fan vault, which comes again originally from Gloucester. It's the greatest high-level fan vault in England, which means in the world. And it's absolutely sensational. There you are, the fan vault. Now again, how long did this take? Well, We know the master mason was called John Wastell, and he contracted, they drew up contracts, to do all this work, it's all in stone, in 36 months. And he completed the contract in 36 months. And it's really quite amazing. By the way, you can see that he had to make compromises. It wasn't intended to be like this, because a fan vault should be a complete semicircle. These aren't, they're sort of overlap. And a fan vault doesn't have a transverse arch bisecting it, like you have here. So it's a sort of compromise, but it really is sensational. There's a great deal I could say about the fan vault at King's, but it's absolutely glorious. Oh, just to give you an idea, these towers with little spiral staircases in were built between March and June 1515. 3 of them were built in that time. So just a matter of weeks. They, you know, sensational, and the pinnacles as well. Just another, we're coming to the close, and I really need more time. What I wanted to make 2 sort of rather large points in the time we've got left. The first of all is that the latter stages of the building of King's overlaps with the onset, the beginning, of the Renaissance, which we might call the Italian Renaissance. And you can see that in the screen. Strictly speaking, this is called a pulpitum, because that is Italian, probably Italian carpenters, coming from Italy in the reign of Anne Boleyn, Henry and Anne, his second wife. There are the initials. And working in a style which was completely different from the rest of King's. This is Henry VIII wanting to make himself a modern European prince, importing the new style. And there's the Italian way of doing things, and there is the King's way of doing things. I could say a lot about that too, but we'd better press on, because I'm going to move on from that too. Just to point out, and this requires another lecture, that the windows, the greatest display of stained glass in England after York Minster is in King's College. It's amazing that it survived. It was all done between 1515 and 1547, so in the reign of Henry VIII. Henry VIII was very generous in paying for this. By the way, he used money from the dissolution of the monasteries to do this, so it's a bit paradoxical. And it would take a long time to explain everything that's going on here. You need a little guidebook. But essentially what's happening is, in the lower windows is the New Testament, that's the life of the Virgin and Christ. And in the upper windows is the Old Testament. And these are typological, that is, the lower scenes are matched with the upper scenes. Now, stained glass, very crudely speaking, had 2 purposes in the medieval world. One was to give a sort of almost, an unworldly sense of the celestial state, to transport you really into the visions of the book of Revelations. You know, it was, yes, a form of transportation. But the other was to tell stories. And the two ideas fight against each other. One, an idea really of lack of clarity, the other of necessary clarity. And so this is how they're very difficult to read when you're in the chapel, to understand what each scene is. This one, for instance, when you look closely, you can see that Christ is being mocked, that is, ridiculed, and that's that window here. And for instance, it's matched with this window, which is Shimei mocking David. So the 2 go together. This is the betrayal of Christ, and this is Cain and Abel. Often the upper windows will have landscapes, the Old Testament, The new world is a built-up world, the New Testament. So it goes like that. But you need a lot of guidance and patience to look at these things. I show you in the Great East window, of course, which we haven't time again to look at. This is Pontius Pilate. And you can see that he's sitting on a throne, I hope you can see this, which is entirely Italian Renaissance. Mm-hmm. So the Italian Renaissance has come to Cambridge. A figure like that derives entirely, I hope you've heard of the Italian painter Raphael. And figures like this, muscle-bound, come from the Italian sculptor and painter Michelangelo. So these are some of the first examples in Northern Europe, and you find them in Kings, of the Italian High Renaissance coming into a great building. So really rather remarkable. And all the, just be patient to look at the windows. Some of the detailing, the landscapes, little boat here. This is a scene from a window of Paul. This is manna falling from heaven. Oh, just absolutely exquisite. These glaziers, by the way, who did all this, came from the Netherlands. They weren't English at all. No English artist could do this sort of thing. And here you've got 3 windows depicting the story of Paul. Now this is where I'm going to finish with this, just to say this. And again, it's going much too fast, all of this, but it's another thought I want to plant in your minds, and you can take it away. And that is, these windows, which are on the south side, they're windows 21, 22 and 23, and almost incomprehensible. You look at them and you think, what on earth is going on here? Again, you've got 4 scenes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and you've got messengers explaining in between, as best they can, what these scenes mean, but they're almost all devoted to the apostle, well, not the apostle, to Paul. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, Paul was the hero of the Protestant reformers. At a late stage in the making of the windows of Kings, there was a change of mind, and Paul was brought in. He became the subject of these windows. Now, why is that? Well, let's go back to what I was saying earlier. The problem with Cambridge becoming a great university, which it certainly was by the early 16th century, by the time of the completion of King's College Chapel, this was certainly a great university. The problem with great university is that people start thinking what they're not supposed to think. And that happened in Cambridge, because in the 1520s, the Lutheran Reformation in Germany, disruptive, shocking, anti-papist, came across the North Sea, not to Oxford, but to Cambridge. And around about King's Parade, there was a pub there where the reformers gathered. People like Coverdale and Barnes and Cranmer and Ridley. These were all the great heroes of the Protestant Reformation in England. They were all Cambridge-based, and they were dissidents. So Cambridge became a fearful and fearsome centre of dissent.